If you haven't heard of the Disney Prince books, they're supposed to be the Disney Princess movies from the prince's perspective. This one, or at least part of this one, Prince of Glass and Midnight, is Cinderella from the prince's perspective. His name's August, so that's what I'll be calling him. This book is 377 pages. The part of this book that's actually what the prince was doing during the film is less than 100 pages. Far less than 100 pages. So most of this is a prequel to Cinderella. What you're probably wondering is, how does it handle the relationship between August and Cinderella? Not only have these two met before the ball, they're actually childhood friends who exchange letters for a while. And I will not object if someone wants to be upset about that being revisionist. Most of the book's plot revolves around this curse that's on Cinderella's hometown, which is making people forget a specific person, as in their memories are rewritten without that person in them. Now you're probably hearing that and thinking, okay, so does Cinderella forget August? Does August forget Cinderella? Or does both happen? And I guess I won't spoil exactly what happens. The investigation of the memory loss curse takes up a lot of the book, unfortunately. Like, there's so many scenes where they're interviewing someone, getting the details of their memory loss, and they end up saying very, very similar things over and over again. I kept expecting them to say, that's what we've been doing for the first 50 pages, but now we're going to do something else, but that keeps going. There's conversations that happen between interviews, yes, of course, but it's not really that interesting. But it's not that horrible either, and there's scenes with August and Ella talking to each other, and it's okay-ish, it's kind of good chemistry, but it's not mind-blowing either. And with that, I have set the context for a visual display of the quality of not only this book, but of the 3 Disney Prince books. If you want to know the quality of all 3 Disney Prince books, I have it all laid out right here. The first one was Prince of Song and Sea. That one I really loved all the way through. There's additional adventures that got packed in. Eric has interesting stuff to struggle with. His relationship with Ariel is really adorable. They have such a cute way of communicating despite the fact that Ariel can't talk, and it only gets better at the end. Prince of Thorns and Nightmares started out pretty bad, in my opinion. I thought I was going to hate Prince of Thorns and Nightmares. I didn't like how the depiction of Philip started out. I was not having it. So the book starts with, how could you do this? Look how they massacred my boy. And it got better as it went. There's an action scene here, an action scene there. The plot gets more interesting, and Philip becomes a better character. So it ends in a place where I'm thinking, I'm glad I read it. Prince of Glass and Midnight is constantly okay-ish the whole way through. That was meant to be a straight line across. I might have drawn it a little bit wonkily. It's supposed to be a straight level line, so just pretend that's what I drew. It has a constant level of decent-ish, which is better than how Thorns and Nightmares started, but is worse than how Thorns and Nightmares ended. Honestly, I could have drawn this better, so it's not like this is exact quality measurements, and I probably should have had Thorns and Nightmares intersect with Glass and Midnight a bit sooner, but I'm sure you get the idea. The early Disney princess films left a lot to interpretation, and this book has a very clear interpretation of Cinderella's character, which you may or may not like. This book acknowledges that Cinderella could leave her terrible stepmother and stepsisters who make her do all the work, but she doesn't because family, and she doesn't care how many people tell her you don't have family, you have relatives. I think it's better for Cinderella to not realize she could leave and think that there's nowhere else for her to go, because to have her know she can leave and stay anyway kind of makes it feel like she's somewhat doing this to herself. It's entirely possible for you to watch the movie and think, I don't know where she would go if she would leave, but this book has people who like Cinderella and would offer her a job and everything. And Cinderella acknowledges that other people don't agree with her staying with the Tremaines, and no, we don't agree with her staying with the Tremaines, especially since we, the audience, know what Lady Tremaine does at the end. I mean, sure, in real life there are people who victimize themselves, but in real life, it's hard to sympathize with those people when they verbally stand by their decisions. Cinderella acts like she's doing the right thing when she's continuing to stick with the Tremaines despite all the nastiness they put her through. And that disconnect might be why I struggle to remember some of the conversations she had with August. I remember there being conversations between the two of them, but I don't remember that much about what was being said. And another thing that I must complain about is the lack of the talking mice in this book. If I have to read one more Disney Cinderella book where there's not a single line of dialogue from the mice, I'm going to explode. The mice are Cinderella's equivalent of the Seven Dwarfs or the Three Good Fairies. Those mice carried the film on their back doing their comedy segments, saving the day at the end, doing the Lord's work, and they deserve respect. And I slapped the face of every Disney Cinderella retelling that does not include talking mice. Prince of Glass and Midnight acknowledges the mice's existence, but it never has any lines of dialogue from them. It's so frustrating that the mice have such a fun way of talking in Cinderella, and yet other Cinderella retellings refuse to let them talk. In the live-action Cinderella, the mice couldn't talk. In So This Is Love, A Twisted Tale, the mice existed but couldn't talk, and they were only in the first chapter or two, maybe it was the second chapter. And in this, they're acknowledged, but they never get to talk. Such tragic, I am devastated. The characterization of August in this book is, you guessed it, okay-ish, I guess. Thankfully, it's not another case of the protagonist not wanting to do the plot. Very early on, it's established that August loves his kingdom, he loves his people, and he's itching to go do the plot and get stuff done. And he says a lot of jokes, however, I don't want to complain about the jokes, it's just that I wasn't really laughing that much. I would say that I acknowledged that his jokes were amusing, I guess. Well, he did do a pun joke, and that I facepalmed, but it wasn't bad apart from that. It talks a lot about August's grief over the death of his mother, and he worries about losing a wife the way his father lost a wife. But thankfully that doesn't really create any roadblocks with his development with Cinderella. That could have been really frustrating. There could have been scenes where they're about to kiss and then August pulls back because childhood trauma, but thankfully that scenario does not happen. That would have been annoying. The stuff that August's character does right, I feel like I didn't really enjoy it as much as I could or should have, because I wasn't really getting into the book, and I feel like if I had a more interesting story, I would have been more engrossed and felt for him more. Here's the thing about August's mission: to figure out what's going on with the curse. In this book, August interviews people, he writes stuff down, and he collects items that are relevant to the curse. In Prince of Song and Sea, Eric is going on voyages, finding these ghost siren things, fighting sword fights, getting attacked by monsters, discovering an island with inhuman stuff on it, putting pirates in their place and dealing with Ursula's mind control. In Prince of Thorns and Nightmares, Philip is on a quest to kill the ultimate dark fairy. He's having these shared dreams with someone he's never met before. They're sending him into a cave where there's this immortal Jaggernaut living there, and he has to get something that belongs to that Jaggernaut. He's learning about magic from fairies, and he's also getting into sword fights. Prince of Glass and Midnight has no action scenes. There's no combat. I mean, granted, you don't need combat for a book to be good, but when you have a third book in a series, and the first two books had combat, you kind of expect a third book to have combat. So what does he actually do besides just talk to people? Very little. In fact, everybody does very little outside of just talking to people. It feels like there's so little that actually happens in this book. I mean, yes, it has the relationship between August and Cinderella. They were childhood best friends, and then they wrote to each other from a distance, and then they stopped writing to each other. So at first it's awkward, and then they get past the barriers and get to grow their relationship, but it's surrounded by so much nothingness that it's so hard to get into. I mean, there's one part that's kind of more interesting where he's sneaking into somebody's house, listening into a conversation, then starts talking to someone else, but I can't fully appreciate it because once he starts talking to that other guy, it just starts going into very similar details that we've been hearing from the other interviewees this entire time. And it's been going on for way too long, so I'm like, okay, you did that kind of a bit more interestingly, but it's still what you've been doing this entire time. When I made my visual depiction earlier, like I said before, I should have had the point where Glass and Midnight and Thorns and Nightmares intersect happen a bit sooner, because ultimately I would say that Thorns and Nightmares is a more worth reading book than Glass and Midnight, making Prince of Glass and Midnight the weakest of the 3 Disney Prince books so far. It wasn't abysmal. I wasn't in pain while reading it, but I was very disappointed, and this book had no right to be so eventless and lacking. I can only recommend this to people who just want to read all the Disney Prince books. If you are in this no matter what, and you want to at least know what happens in all the Disney Prince books, then sure, you could read this and not want to crash your car afterwards. But you can be a fan of the series and love the first 2 books and still say, I have standards, I only want to read the good stuff. And in that case, I would say you can skip this one, I think. Normally when I do a review of a book that I don't exactly recommend wholeheartedly, I like to also talk about books that I do recommend at the end of the video. However, I haven't actually finished reading any other books since the last time I made a book review. In my Tangled Up in You video, I was saying that I didn't like Tangled Up in You, but I did like the first book in the Eisenhorn series, the Warhammer 40k Eisenhorn series. What happened was, after I made that video, I started reading the second book of the Eisenhorn series, and then Prince of Glass and Midnight arrived midway through, and I really wanted to make a video about Prince of Glass and Midnight, so I decided to put Eisenhorn on hold. I like it so far, though. And ever so conveniently for me, they released Sally's Lament, A Twisted Tale a few days after Prince of Glass and Midnight. So this book has had to wait until I was done with Glass and Midnight, and this is going to be the next book I'll read and review. Don't get confused, I'm not saying I recommend or unrecommend this book yet. I finished reading Prince of Glass and Midnight last night, and I'm going to start reading Sally's Lament tonight. The author of this book is Mari Mancusi. She co-wrote Frozen, Polar Nights Cast into Darkness. That book I hated, but it's impossible to know where Mari Mancusi ended and Jen Kalanita? I think she co-wrote it with Jen Kalanita. I didn't know how much of it was either of their faults, but then I read Suddenly Super, which was just by Jen Kalanita, and I hated that book. And then I read Set in Stone, which was written by just Mari Mancusi, and I thought that book was kind of okay. I thought it was good-ish, I think. But I'm wary of this one, and here's why. Set in Stone had 2 protagonists. One of them was Arthur from Sword in the Stone, and the other was Guinevere. It could be that she didn't have Guinevere completely overshadow Arthur just because Guinevere wasn't in the movie Sword in the Stone, so that would have been weird. But now the what-if question for this book is, what if Sally discovered Christmas Town? Which sort of sounds like she's going to completely overshadow Jack from The Nightmare Before Christmas, and it's kind of plausible that she might do that because, unlike the Guinevere and Sword in the Stone thing, Sally actually was in Nightmare Before Christmas, so it's not like a completely new character would be taking over. I would like for Sally and Jack to both be very prominent, but I'm not betting on that being the case. Let's hope that this book at least is not as bad as the last Sally-centric book I read. I don't know if my sanity can handle another one of those. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and be better than just okay-ish.